Hi, my name is David Christopher Lane. I'm a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and the founder of the Neural Surfer YouTube channel. Today I bring you Oceans of Compassion, Thrones of Snow, the Dalai Lamas, and the Making of Tibetan Buddhism. This will give you a history of the 14 Dalai Lamas and also a history about Tibetan Buddhism and how it emerged into Tibet from India and other places, and also the invasion of the Chinese, and also the great game between the British and the Russians who try to orchestrate or control certain regions in that area. I first actually read about Tibetan Buddhism by a book translated by Evan Wentz, although I don't think he was the real translator, but I think he was the orchestrator of it, that was published by Oxford University Press, and it's still popular today, called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but also about Tibetan yoga. And I used to carry it around at Notre Dame High School, even though I don't think I understood most of it at the time, because it's very psychologically astute. You know, if you ever get a chance to read the idea that the illusions, that is, the visions that you have in the near-death experience, the Bardo state, are projections of your own mind, this is a very psychologically sophisticated text in religion, where a lot of times people believe the projections as entities coming from an external source, not from the sources of their own brain or mind. I'll tell you a couple of stories. One is my old colleague at Mount San Antonio College, a wonderful man named Professor Gary Inky. He had met the Dalai Lama, I think it was in Harvard, and I guess they struck a conversation up, and I think they ended up, if I'm not mistaken on this one, because the Dalai Lama eats meat, I think they ended up at McDonald's eating some chicken McNuggets or whatever, and said the Dalai Lama was a very normal, very nice person, very engaging. And the second story, I was at the Bodhi Tree bookstore when I was a young kid, and there was this really handsome man that walked in, and he was looking around and he wasn't certain about which section to find what he was looking for. And he came up to me, because I knew the Bodhi Tree really well, because I was sitting there reading a book, because in those days I didn't have much money to buy a book, so they allowed you to sit and kind of open up a book, kind of like they do somewhat at Barnes & Noble. And he asked me where the Tibetan Buddhist section was, and in the Bodhi Tree in those days they had a really pretty large Buddhist section, and I took him right to where it was. Well, it turned out to be Richard Gere, and as you know, he has a deep connection to Tibetan Buddhism, and my mentor, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, was good friends with the late Robert Thurman, who, as you perhaps know, that he's the father of Uma Thurman, he was a great Tibetan scholar and had written lots of books on this. And there's another guy, if you ever get a chance, in terms of scholarship, Daniel Lopez, and he's published much through the University of Chicago Press on Buddhism, and it's very excellent text that he's written, very informative. But for most people, they know about Tibetan Buddhism because of the Dalai Lama, because he won the Nobel Prize. If I'm not mistaken, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. Now, he has had some scandals. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important to understand, that when you pull the curtain behind gurus or mystics or Dalai Lamas, you find out they make mistakes. Like the Dalai Lama, a lot of people don't know this, had some really antiquarian views about homosexuality, which he changed over time. The same thing happened in Radhaswami, when you have people like Charan Singh had some unusual views about homosexuality, which were part and parcel of his time period, but now has been modified and changed by his successor, Gurinder Singh. It takes over time, but what that makes you realize is the humanness of these people, and that we should not project upon them this notion of omniscience, that is, they know all things and they know better than anybody else. That's not true. They can be limited, they can be narrow-minded, given their culture, given their time, given their personality, like all of us. And I think the more we understand that, we can appreciate when they rise above the notions of just purely human, that is, when they act in really magnificent ways, but at the same time ground it when they make mistakes or we find flaws, like we all do. Like we all have to look in the mirror in a way. But when you see the history of the Dalai Lamas, you'll find out how human they could be. I think it was one particular Dalai Lama who had a number of concubines and was, probably drinking and partying and doing all sorts of strange things. And yet he was, well, the same thing happens in the Catholic Church. Like I was brought up in the Roman Catholic Church. I went to Catholic elementary school, I went to Catholic high school. And the scandal regarding the priest is just unconscionable. and it's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I guess in all of this, we want to keep grounded to the humanness of it, even if they have these incredible thrones and incredible magnificent temples, and they look like they're transcendent beings from another world. No, they're just human beings in a very highly elevated position. But to the great credit of the Dalai Lama, the present one, he said a couple things which I think are very admirable. He said this to Carl Sagan. If I'm not mistaken, or at least Carl Sagan quoted it. He said that if science found out that reincarnation was untrue for some factual, empirical reason, that the idea was just unsustainable, he said that Buddhism would have to change and take a more scientific viewpoint. That is really to his credit. And at the same time, you give credit to the Dalai Lama for the idea of trying to spread compassion to other religions and to other beings, in fact, to all beings. Whether or not they all live up to it, or whether I live up to it, or other people live up to it, at least it's a beautiful ideal. So there's a lot to recommend about Tibetan Buddhism, and there's some things you've got to be cautious about. But this is an interesting history, and I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks so much.
Oceans of compassion, thrones of snow. The Dalai Lamas and the making of Tibetan Buddhism. A note on names, miracles, politics, and the word last. There have been 14 recognized Dalai Lamas. The present 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is the latest. Not, so far as anyone can say, the last. In a statement released in July 2025, he declared that the institution would continue after his death, and that responsibility for recognizing his successor would rest with the Gaden Phodrang Trust, acting in consultation with the leaders of Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the customary religious authorities. The Chinese government, by contrast, maintains that any successor must be approved by Beijing and identified through procedures that include the Golden Urn. Thus, even before a 15th Dalai Lama exists, two rival visions of his, or possibly her, legitimacy are already confronting one another. The story that follows moves between two kinds of history. One is the history preserved within Tibetan Buddhism. Prophetic dreams, miraculous signs, children who remember earlier lives, oracles who speak through entranced mediums, bodies that turn mysteriously after death, and boys who correctly identify possessions belonging to their predecessors. These accounts cannot always be independently verified, but they should not simply be discarded. They reveal how Tibetans understood legitimacy, sanctity, memory, and the continuity of spiritual authority. The other is the history reconstructed through chronicles, government records, correspondence, biographies, diplomatic reports, autobiographies, and modern scholarship. It is a history of monasteries and armies, pilgrims and princes, Mongol cavalry and British machine guns, Manchu emperors and communist revolutionaries. The Dalai Lamas existed in both histories at once. They were regarded as emanations of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, yet they also inherited estates, negotiated with rulers, appointed ministers, collected taxes, confronted rebellions, and sometimes fled for their lives. Neither dimension can be understood without the other. To treat the Dalai Lamas only as saints is to miss the political institution constructed around them. To treat them only as political inventions is to miss the religious convictions that made the institution possible, and that have enabled it to survive civil wars, invasions, assassinations, disputed successions, premature deaths, and exile. The Tibetan names in this account sometimes appear in several English spellings. Gendun Drub may be written Gedun Drupa, Kelsang Gyatso may be Kelsang Gyatso. Tubten Gyatso may appear as Tubten Gyatso. Dates can vary slightly because Tibetan and Western calendrical systems do not always align neatly. I have used the most common modern forms and dates. Above all, Tibet must not be imagined as a permanently fixed political unit identical across every century. Historical Tibet contained regions with different political relationships and identities. Central Tibet, including U and Tsang, Kham in the east, and Amdo in the northeast. Local princes, monastic estates, Mongol chiefs, Qing officials, Tibetan ministers, hereditary aristocrats, and regional rulers all exercised authority at different times. The Dalai Lamas did not inherit a finished Tibetan nation-state. Their institution helped create one conception of Tibet, even as Tibet's frontiers and political status remained contested. Prologue. The boy who knew the Lama. The man who arrived at the farmhouse was dressed like a servant. It was an effective disguise. The search party had come into Amdo in northeastern Tibet through territory controlled by a Muslim warlord, announcing that they were looking for the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama could invite interference, extortion, or the concealment of promising children. So the senior Lama in the party, Kyutsang Rinpoche, put on ordinary clothes. A junior official dressed as the master. The men approached the house without revealing why they had come. Inside was a small boy named Lamo Thondup. He was 2 years old. The search had begun after the death of the 13th Dalai Lama in December 1933. According to the official recognition account, the embalmed body of the dead ruler, originally facing south, appeared to turn toward the northeast. The regent later visited Lamo Latso, the sacred Oracle Lake south of Lhasa, where he believed he saw Tibetan letters and images indicating the direction of the search. A monastery with a turquoise and gold roof, a road, and a house with distinctive gutters. The letters were interpreted as pointing toward Amdo and Kumbum Monastery. When the disguised visitors entered the farmhouse, the child reportedly went directly to Kyutsang Rinpoche and treated him as though he recognized him. He called him Sera Lama, identifying the monastery with which the visitor was connected. On a later visit, the search party presented the boy with paired objects. Some had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, others were imitations or similar objects. The boy was said to have repeatedly selected the former Dalai Lama's possessions. From the viewpoint of Tibetan religious tradition, these were not parlor tricks. A tulku, a deliberately reborn religious master, might retain traces of memory, affinity, or recognition from a previous life. The objects did not create the child's identity, they disclosed it. The search party combined such tests with divination, physical observations, consultation with prominent lamas, and the signs already interpreted by the regent. From the viewpoint of critical history, the recognition narratives were preserved and shaped by institutions that had a powerful interest in establishing continuity. Yet the searchers had not chosen an aristocrat from Lhasa. They had traveled far into Amdo and selected the young son of farmers. Whatever one concludes about reincarnation, the people conducting the search appear to have believed that the boy mattered. The child left Amdo in July 1939, entered Lhasa on October 8th, and was enthroned in the Potala Palace on February 22, 1940. He began a monastic education designed to transform a village child into a philosopher, ritual master, and eventually ruler. 10 years later, as armies crossed Tibet's eastern frontiers, he would be asked to assume full political authority while still 15 years old. 9 years after that, disguised as a soldier beneath a darkened sky, he would flee the palace from which 13 predecessors had ruled or been represented. The ceremony in 1940 looked ancient. The throne, silk brocades, monastic chants, state officials and ritual objects conveyed the impression of a lineage descending through the centuries. But the office placed upon that child had not always existed. The first Dalai Lama never knew that he was the first Dalai Lama. The second was the first member of the line to be recognized as the reincarnation of his predecessor. The third was the first to receive the title. The fourth was Mongolian. The fifth was the first to rule Tibet. The sixth abandoned monastic vows and became famous for love poems. 4 successive Dalai Lamas died before the age of 22. One fled the British, another fled Qing troops, and the present Dalai Lama fled the People's Liberation Army. The institution was not born fully formed. It was assembled, life by life, crisis by crisis, out of Buddhism, memory, Mongol patronage, monastic organization, military victory, imperial recognition, and popular faith. To understand how it became possible, we must begin centuries before the first of the 14 was born. Part 1. The religion that remade Tibet. 1. Before the Dalai Lamas. Tibet did not begin as the Buddhist civilization later imagined by Western travelers. Before the Dalai Lamas, before the great monastic universities, and before the Potala rose above Lhasa, Tibet was the center of a formidable highland empire. During the 7th century, the Yarlung kings consolidated power across the plateau. Under Songtsen Gampo, Tibetan forces and diplomacy brought the kingdom into sustained contact with Nepal, China, Central Asia, and the Buddhist cultures surrounding the Himalayas. Later, Tibetan tradition remembered Songtsen Gampo as an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara and credited his Nepalese and Chinese queens with encouraging Buddhism. Temples associated with this first diffusion, especially the Yokang in Lhasa, became sacred centers of Tibetan religious memory. Yet the deeper institutional establishment of Buddhism occurred in the 8th century. King Trisong Detsen invited the Indian scholar Shantaraksita to Tibet. Shantaraksita represented the scholastic culture of India's great Buddhist universities: rigorous logic, monastic discipline, philosophical analysis, and the study of the middle way. Tibetan sources tell of resistance from local spirits and hostile forces, leading to the invitation of Padmasambhava, the tantric adept later known to Tibetans as Guru Rinpoche. Where Shantaraksita embodied the monastery and philosophical academy, Padmasambhava embodied tantric mastery, the ritual ability to bind, transform, or enlist unseen powers. Together, in Tibetan memory, they represented 2 indispensable faces of Buddhism. Sami, Tibet's first major Buddhist monastery, was founded during this period. There, Tibetan monks were ordained, texts were translated, and Indian systems of philosophy and ritual began to take root. Translation was not a secondary activity. It was the making of an intellectual civilization. Tibetan translators and Indian panditas developed precise vocabularies capable of carrying complex ideas about consciousness, logic, ethics, emptiness, compassion, meditation, and tantric practice across languages. The Tibetan Buddhist canon eventually preserved an enormous body of Indian literature, much of which disappeared from India after the decline and destruction of its major Buddhist institutions. Tibetan Buddhism would later be portrayed as exotic, isolated, or uniquely Tibetan. but its foundations were profoundly cosmopolitan. They included Indian monastic codes, Mahayana philosophy, tantric ritual, Central Asian contacts, Nepalese art, Chinese influences, and indigenous Tibetan practices. By the 13th century, Tibetan translations had preserved thousands of Indian Buddhist works. Buddhism did not simply eliminate what came before it. Tibet possessed royal rituals, funerary traditions, divination, mountain gods, territorial spirits, healing practices, and priestly specialists. Over time, Buddhist teachers interpreted many local deities as protectors who had been subdued and bound by oath to defend the Dharma. Buddhist and non-Buddhist practices borrowed from and competed with one another. The tradition, now known as Bön, developed in continuing conversation with Buddhism, and should not be treated simply as an unchanged fossil of one uniform pre-Buddhist religion. The Tibetan Empire fractured in the 9th century. Traditional Buddhist histories blamed the anti-Buddhist king Langdharma, assassinated by a monk in a famously dramatic episode. Older accounts describe a period of persecution in which monasteries closed and the monastic lineage nearly disappeared from central Tibet. Modern scholarship tends to treat the collapse more cautiously. The end of royal patronage, dynastic conflict, regional fragmentation, and economic disruption may have mattered as much as any systematic campaign of persecution. Buddhism weakened institutionally, but it did not vanish. Ritual lineages, texts, family traditions, and localized communities survived. Beginning in the late 10th and 11th centuries, a later diffusion transformed Tibet. Tibetans traveled to India and Nepal seeking teachers and manuscripts. Indian masters journeyed to Tibet. New monasteries were established, new translation lineages formed, and old teachings were reorganized. One of the most influential arrivals was Atisha Dipamkara Srijnana, who reached Tibet in 1042. Atisha offered a disciplined sequence of practice that joined ethical conduct, compassion, philosophical understanding, and tantric methods. His followers became associated with the Kadam tradition, the idea that the profound should rest upon the morally sound, that Tantra, without ethical and intellectual foundations, could become dangerous or corrupt, would later profoundly influence Tsongkhapa and the Gelug school from which the Dalai Lama lineage emerged. Other traditions took shape. The Nyingma, the ancient school, traced its central transmissions to the imperial period and especially to Padmasambhava. Its masters cultivated tantric revelation, dzogchen, or great perfection teachings, and the discovery of concealed spiritual treasures known as terma. The Kagyu traditions emphasized lineages descending from Indian tantric adepts such as Tilopa and Naropa, through the Tibetan translator Marpa and the yogi poet Milarepa. The Sakya school, named for the monastery founded in 1073, developed a formidable synthesis of scholarship, tantra, and hereditary leadership. These schools were not denominations in the modern Western sense. Their adherents did not necessarily imagine themselves as belonging exclusively to one sealed institution. Teachers received transmissions across lineages. Families supported several traditions. Monasteries possessed distinctive curricula and ritual inheritances, but the boundaries could be porous. Rivalry existed, sometimes bitterly, but so did exchange. Monasteries became far more than places where men withdrew from society. They were educational institutions, landholders, employers, ritual centers, libraries, courts of influence, and political actors. Some maintained large estates and dependent communities. Some formed alliances with aristocratic families or regional rulers. The expansion of monastic Buddhism created concentrations of literate personnel and durable institutions capable of surviving the deaths of individual patrons. By the high medieval period, Buddhism had become Tibet's dominant cultural force, and monasteries had become central to its religious, economic, and political life. This created a problem that would prove decisive. What happened when a charismatic Lama died? A monastery could survive, a lineage of teaching could pass to a disciple, an hereditary religious family could transmit authority to a son or nephew. But the death of an especially powerful master might fracture networks of patrons, estates, disciples, and teachings. Tibetan Buddhism developed another solution. The master would return. 2. The invention of the reincarnate Lama. Buddhists had always believed in rebirth. The historical Buddha taught that beings pass through repeated lives according to karma until liberation. Mahayana Buddhism added the ideal of the bodhisattva, a being who renounces final release in order to continue assisting others. The Tibetan Tulku institution made a more specific claim. Certain accomplished teachers could direct their rebirth, return in identifiable human form, and resume their work. A child could therefore inherit not merely property or office, but an identity extending through previous lives. The earliest major continuing reincarnation lineage is generally associated with the Karmapas of the Karma Kagyu school. By the 13th century, disciples were identifying a child as the rebirth of a deceased master. The practice offered continuity while avoiding straightforward hereditary succession. Authority could leave one family, region, or social class and reappear elsewhere. In principle, a peasant's son could be the rebirth of a great Lama. In practice, recognition involved institutions, patrons, politics, and sometimes intense competition. The theological logic was elegant. A realized bodhisattva did not return helplessly under the force of karma. He returned intentionally. His body changed, but the compassionate purpose continued. The new child was not merely a successor trained to imitate the old master. He was the continuation of the master's enlightened activity. The institutional logic was equally powerful. A monastery could preserve the estate and authority of a dead Lama while waiting for his reincarnation. During the child's minority, regents, attendants, stewards, and tutors administered affairs. Once educated, the Tulku could assume the responsibilities of his predecessor. But a child also created opportunities. Those who controlled his education controlled access to him. Regents could govern for years. Aristocratic families might gain immense status if their son were selected. Regional factions might promote rival candidates. A Tulku lineage could therefore produce continuity and recurrent instability at the same time. Recognition was never governed by one rigid procedure. A dying Lama might leave a letter or verbal clues. The direction in which his body faced, the pattern of smoke from cremation, dreams experienced by disciples, visions in sacred lakes, statements by oracles, and unusual events surrounding a child's birth could all be considered. Search parties investigated promising boys. Candidates might recognize former servants, recall places, speak dialects not used in their homes, or select the deceased Lama's possessions from groups of similar objects. Senior Lamas, including the Panchen Lama in later Dalai Lama searches, often performed tonsha, naming, or ordination ceremonies. Regents oversaw the political and administrative stages of search, recognition, transport, and enthronement. For believers, these methods allowed spiritual identity to reveal itself through multiple converging signs. For skeptics, they allowed wide interpretive discretion. Both observations can be true. Recognition was neither a simple fraud nor a laboratory experiment. It was a culturally structured process in which religious conviction, personal testimony, institutional judgment, and political interest interacted. The Dalai Lama lineage entered this already developing world of reincarnate lamas. It was not the first Tulku line, not originally the most powerful, and not initially a government. Its founder was a monk who never heard the name by which history remembers him. 3. Tsongkhapa and the Yellow Hats. In 1357, 34 years before the birth of the future first Dalai Lama, a boy named Lobsang Drakpa was born in Amdo. History remembers him as Tsongkhapa, the man from Tsongkha. Tsongkhapa was not merely a founder seeking to create another sect. He was a scholar practitioner attempting to restore discipline and coherence to Tibetan Buddhist life. He studied with teachers from several traditions, mastered major systems of philosophy and tantra, and insisted that realization required both analytical understanding and meditative experience. His writings explored emptiness, dependent origination, ethics, monastic conduct, and the structure of the Buddhist path with extraordinary precision. His movement was first known as the Ganden tradition, after the monastery he founded near Lhasa in 1409. It later became known as Gelug, often translated as the virtuous tradition. Outsiders called its monks yellow hats because of ceremonial headgear, though color alone cannot explain the school's identity. The Gelug achievement was organizational as well as philosophical. Ganden was followed by Drepung in 1416 and Sera in 1419. These became vast monastic universities. Their monks memorized texts, attended lectures, and engaged in vigorous formal debates in which philosophical claims were tested through rapid questions, stamping feet, sweeping arm gestures, and emphatic claps. The training could last decades. This scholastic system didn't reject Tantra. Tsongkhapa was himself a tantric practitioner, but it sought to place tantric initiation and yogic practice upon monastic discipline, compassion, and philosophical understanding. In the Gelug ideal, the mysterious should not replace the rational. The two should discipline one another. Tsongkhapa's immediate successors did not rule Tibet. The political landscape was dominated by regional powers, aristocratic houses, and older religious networks. The rulers of Chang often supported Karma Kagyu institutions, while Gelug influence grew around Lhasa. Monasteries could become entangled in regional rivalry, and doctrinal difference could acquire military patrons. The official head of the Gelug school was, and remains, the Ganden Trippa, the holder of Tsongkhapa's throne. The Dalai Lama never technically replaced that office. Later, Dalai Lamas became the most prominent Gelug-affiliated figures, and eventually the spiritual symbols of Tibet. But they were not simply popes presiding over a single Tibetan Buddhist church. The four principal traditions retained their own hierarchs, lineages, monasteries, teachings, and internal authority. Among Tsongkhapa's disciples was a monk named Gendun Drub. Centuries later, Tibetans would number him first in a succession of rulers and world-famous teachers. In his own lifetime, however, he was something both more modest and more foundational, a scholar building a monastery in a region where his young tradition was not yet dominant. Part 2. The lineage before the throne. 4. The first Dalai Lama, Gendun Drub, the founder who was not yet first. 1391 to 1474. He was born Pema Dorje in 1391 to a nomadic or semi-nomadic family near Sakya in Tsang. Nothing at his birth announced that a future government would count its history from him. His childhood unfolded near one of Tibet's great centers of learning and power. Sakya had once ruled much of Tibet under Mongol patronage. The Gelug movement to which Gendun Drub would devote himself was still new, its future uncertain. At 14, he entered monastic life and received the name Gendun Drub. He later took full ordination and became a disciple of Tsongkhapa. Tibetan tradition remembers Tsongkhapa, presenting him with robes as a sign that he would spread the teachings. Whether one treats the gesture as prophetic or commemorative, Gendun Drub did become one of the principal transmitters of the emerging Gelug tradition. He was not a warrior, prince, or state builder. His power came from learning. He composed extensive works on Buddhist philosophy and practice, taught disciples, and gained a reputation for combining scholarship with contemplation. The qualities later associated with the ideal Dalai Lama, intellectual rigor, disciplined monastic life, and compassionate activity, were present before political sovereignty entered the lineage. His decisive institutional act came in 1447 when he founded Tashilhunpo Monastery near Shigatse. The location mattered. Tsang was not a secure Gelug stronghold. It was a region where Sakya and Kagyu establishments possessed deep roots, and where later rulers would resist the expansion of Gelug power from Lhasa. Tashilhunpo therefore served as both monastery and outpost, a center from which Gelug scholarship could spread westward. The foundation would acquire consequences Gendun Drub could not have anticipated. Tashilhunpo later became the principal seat of the Panchen Lamas, the second most internationally famous incarnation lineage associated with the Gelug school. Panchen Lamas would participate in recognizing, naming, ordaining, and educating Dalai Lamas. At times, the relationship between the two institutions would be intimate. At others, taxation, regional interest, Qing policy, and political rivalry would drive them apart. Gendun Drub remained abbot of Tashilhunpo until his death in 1474. The institutional biography maintained by the present Dalai Lama's office describes him as dying in meditation. Such descriptions belong to Tibetan hagiography, where the manner of death reveals mastery. A historian can verify the monastic foundation and literary legacy more readily than the exact quality of his final consciousness. But the memory is important. The first life of the lineage ended not in a palace, but in a monastery. He was not called Dalai Lama. No such title yet existed. He did not govern central Tibet. He was not enthroned as a child after a state-sponsored search. Only after another boy was recognized as his return did Gendun Drub become the beginning of something. That recognition changed the meaning of his entire life retrospectively. A respected teacher became the first member of a reincarnation lineage. Later, when the third received the title Dalai Lama, that title was projected backward onto Gendun Drub and his successor. History often imagines institutions moving forward from conscious beginnings. The Dalai Lama line moved backward as well. Its third member created its first. 5. The second Dalai Lama, Gendun Gyatso, and the birth of continuity. 1475 to 1476 to 1542. The child born near Shigatse in 1475 or 1476 entered a family with religious connections beyond the Gelug world. His father was associated with Nyingma tantric practice, and the boy grew up near several currents of Tibetan Buddhism. According to traditional accounts, he began speaking about Tashilhunpo and declared that his name was Pema Dorje, the birth name of Gendun Drub. Such stories became evidence that the dead Lama had returned. At about 11, he was recognized and installed at Tashilhunpo as Gendun Drub's reincarnation. This was the moment the lineage truly began. A first life, by itself, is not a reincarnation institution. The recognition of the second establishes that the first death was not an ending, but an interval. Gendun Gyatso was therefore the first Dalai Lama in the procedural sense, the first person in the line to be found as a child and educated as the continuation of a predecessor. Yet his life also exposed a recurring problem. Recognition did not erase institutional rivalry. Relations with Tashilhunpo became difficult, and Gendun Gyatso spent important periods elsewhere. His career carried him from Tsang to the great Gelug monasteries near Lhasa. He became abbot of Drepung in 1517, and later Sera. Through such positions, he linked the reincarnation line to the expanding monastic centers of central Tibet. At Drepung, he established a residence known as the Ganden Phodrang, the Palace of Ganden. At first, it was an estate or residential office associated with the Lama. More than a century later, the name Ganden Phodrang would be applied to the government created under the fifth Dalai Lama. A building within a monastery thus gave its name to the state that eventually ruled from the Potala. Gendun Gyatso also helped revive and strengthen the Great Prayer Festival, or Monlam Chenmo, held in Lhasa during the first lunar month. Tsongkhapa had inaugurated the festival in 1409. It brought thousands of monks into the city for prayers, examinations, rituals, public offerings, and teachings. Monlam was devotional, scholastic, civic, and political at once. For a period each year, monastic authority became dramatically visible in the streets and temples of Lhasa. The second's life complicates any notion that Gelug identity required religious isolation. His family connections and training linked him to Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and Kadam teachings. Tibetan masters could possess a primary institutional affiliation while receiving transmissions from elsewhere. Later Dalai Lamas, especially the 5th and 14th, would display similarly wide-ranging interests. Gendun Gyatso died in 1542. His office was not yet a government, but it now possessed the essential components of durability: a recognized reincarnation line, monastic residences, estates, scholarly prestige, connections to Drepung and Sera, and a growing body of followers. The third life would add something different. He would give the institution its name and connect it to the power of the Mongols. 6. The third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, and the Ocean Khan. 1543 to 1588. Sonam Gyatso was born in 1543 near Lhasa. Tibetan recognition narratives describe unusual signs surrounding his early life. He was identified as Gendun Gyatso's reincarnation, taken to Drepung, ordained, educated, and eventually made abbot of both Drepung and Sera. By then, the Gelug school possessed scholarship and monasteries, but lacked undisputed political dominance. Its institutions stood amid the rivalries of central Tibet, especially between powers associated with U and Tsang. Sonam Gyatso's great opportunity came not from a Tibetan king, but from the Mongolian steppe. The Mongols had a long and complicated relationship with Tibetan Buddhism. In the 13th century, Mongol rulers had supported Sakya hierarchs, who in turn provided religious authority and ritual expertise. The relationship was often described through the Tibetan concept of choyon, priest and patron. The religious teacher offered initiation, legitimacy, and spiritual merit. The patron offered protection, gifts, and worldly power. By the 16th century, Mongol political unity had fractured. Altan Khan, leader of the Tumed Mongols, sought prestige and religious legitimacy. Sonam Gyatso saw an opportunity to expand Gelug teachings and restrain patterns of warfare and sacrifice among Mongol followers. They met in 1578. The meeting transformed them both. Altan Khan bestowed upon Sonam Gyatso the Mongolian title commonly rendered Dalai Lama. Dalai means ocean. Gyatso, already part of Sonam Gyatso's Tibetan name, also means ocean. The full significance is often paraphrased as Ocean of Wisdom, though the historical title carried political and honorific resonances beyond a literal translation. Sonam Gyatso returned the favor by granting Altan Khan an exalted Buddhist title. Each man authenticated the other. The Mongol chief became a protector and king of religion. The Tibetan Lama became an oceanic teacher whose authority reached beyond the plateau. Because Sonam Gyatso was understood to be the third life in his line, the new title was retroactively applied to Gendun Drub and Gendun Gyatso. Thus, Sonam became the third Dalai Lama, while two dead predecessors became the first and second. The encounter is sometimes described as the conversion of the Mongols, but that phrase can mislead. Mongols had encountered and supported Buddhism centuries earlier. Sonam Gyatso's achievement was a renewed and particularly influential Gelug mission. He and his disciples established monasteries, cultivated alliances, and embedded Tibetan Buddhist teachers in Mongol political life. Religious conversion was not simply a change in private belief. It could redirect patronage, reshape law, alter funerary and sacrificial customs, and connect distant communities through monastic networks. Mongol support, in turn, gave the Gelug school access to resources and military allies it did not possess on its own. Sonam Gyatso founded or strengthened important institutions, including Namgyal Monastery, which became closely associated with the Dalai Lama's ritual life. He also established monasteries in Amdo and Kham, including Kumbum, near Tsongkhapa's birthplace, and Lithang Monastery. These foundations would later become central to the stories of the 7th and 14th Dalai Lamas. He died in Mongolia in 1588 while continuing his missionary work. His death posed a test. Would the reincarnation return to Tibet, confirming that Mongol patronage had served a Tibetan institution? Or would the line appear among the Mongols themselves? The answer astonished Tibet. The Dalai Lama was reborn into Altan Khan's family. 7. The 4th Dalai Lama, Yonten Gyatso, the Mongolian incarnation, 1589 to 1617. Yonten Gyatso was born in Mongolia in 1589 within the ruling family connected to Altan Khan. He remains the only Dalai Lama born to an ethnically Mongolian family. For Gelug leaders, his recognition carried enormous advantages. The alliance between the lineage and Mongol patrons was no longer merely diplomatic. Reincarnation had made it genealogical and sacred. The Mongol child was not an external protector of the Dalai Lama. He was the Dalai Lama. Recognition accounts describe predictions by oracles and signs surrounding his birth. The abbot of Ganden accepted him as the reincarnation of Sonam Gyatso. Yet his parents did not immediately surrender him. To give up a child recognized as a great Lama was an honor, but it also meant yielding him to distant institutions and political interests. Yonten Gyatso received an initial religious education in Mongolia before traveling to Tibet in 1601 at about 12 years old. His arrival altered the balance of Tibetan politics. Mongol followers and patrons accompanied or supported him. The Gelug establishment gained an international base of power. Rival factions, especially those aligned with the rulers of Tsang and Karma Kagyu institutions, had reason to view the relationship with alarm. It would be too simple to reduce Tibetan conflict to a war between religious schools. Political rulers supported monasteries, and monasteries supported political rulers. Religious identities overlapped with regional rivalry, aristocratic ambition, taxation, landholding, and military alliance. But the presence of a Mongolian Dalai Lama unmistakably increased the political weight of the Gelug leadership. Yonten Gyatso became abbot of Drepung and later Sera. He received full ordination from the Panchen Lama Lobsang Chokye Gyaltsen, an eminent scholar whose own reincarnation lineage would soon become increasingly important. The fourth died at Drepung in 1617, only 27 or 28 years old. His life was too short for him to convert inherited prestige into stable government. Yet his Mongolian birth had permanently strengthened the alliance that would make Gelug political victory possible. A child born the same year in southern Tibet would be recognized as his successor. The boy would become known as the Great Fifth. Unlike the first four, he would not merely inherit monasteries and patrons. He would inherit a civil war and emerge with a country. Part 3. The throne is built. 8. The fifth Dalai Lama, Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso, and the creation of the Tibetan state. 1617 to 1682. The future fifth Dalai Lama was born in 1617, at a time when recognition itself was dangerous. The rulers of Tsang had become the most formidable power in central Tibet. Their political alliances included important Karma Kagyu hierarchs and institutions. Gelug monasteries around Lhasa possessed large populations and powerful patrons, but faced military pressure. Under such conditions, the discovery of a new Dalai Lama was not merely religious news. It could alter alliances and provoke intervention. The boy's recognition was therefore initially concealed. According to the official account, attendants showed him objects belonging to the fourth Dalai Lama, and he identified them as his own. Once circumstances permitted, he was taken to Drepung, ordained, and named Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso. He was intellectually unusual. He studied Gelug philosophy, but also developed deep interests in Nyingma teachings, visionary traditions, ritual, history, poetry, medicine, astrology, and statecraft. His collected writings eventually filled many volumes. His autobiography remains one of the richest sources for 17th century Tibetan life. Yet scholarship alone did not bring him to power. That required Gushi Khan. Gushi Khan was the leader of the Koshot Mongols and a committed Gelug patron. During the 1630s and early 1640s, he intervened militarily against rulers and factions hostile to Gelug interests. His armies defeated opponents in eastern Tibet and then crushed the Tsangpa regime. In 1642, following military victory, Gushi Khan ceremonially transferred governing authority over central Tibet to the fifth Dalai Lama. The moment is often described as the unification of Tibet. It did bring Yu and Tsang under a new central government, but the word can conceal the violence that made the settlement possible. The Ganden Phodrang government emerged from civil war and Mongol conquest, as well as religious prestige. This was the crucial turning point in the lineage. The first four Dalai Lamas had been spiritual teachers and monastic leaders. The fifth became the head of a government. The office now joined religious and temporal authority, although day-to-day administration was often delegated to a daisy, or regent administrator, and shared among monk officials, lay nobles, monastic institutions, regional elites, and councils. Calling this system a theocracy captures only part of it. The Ganden Phodrang was a clerical aristocratic state. Monks held major offices, but hereditary nobles did as well. Monasteries owned estates, but so did aristocratic families. Religious legitimacy infused government, yet administration required taxation, law, diplomacy, records, labor, and military power. The fifth understood architecture as political theology. In 1645, construction began on the Potala Palace atop Mapuri, the red hill above Lhasa. The site was associated with the imperial era, King Songtsen Gampo, whom Tibetan tradition regarded as an emanation of Avalokiteshvara. By building there, the fifth connected his new government to Tibet's ancient kings and to the Bodhisattva, whose compassion the Dalai Lamas were said to embody. The Potala was palace, monastery, fortress, administrative center, reliquary, and cosmic statement. Its white and red masses rose above Lhasa like a constructed mountain. The building declared that the Dalai Lama's institution was no longer housed inside Drepung. It now looked down upon the capital. The fifth also helped formalize the Panchen Lama lineage. His respected teacher, Lobsang Chokyi Gyaltsen, was associated with Tashil Hunpo and later counted as the fourth Panchen Lama, with the title projected backward onto earlier incarnations. The Dalai and Panchen lines became interdependent. Each could help recognize and educate the other's successor, creating a reciprocal spiritual relationship. In 1652, the fifth undertook a celebrated journey to meet the Shunji emperor of the newly established Qing dynasty. The Manchu rulers of the Qing were building a vast inner Asian empire containing Manchus, Mongols, Han Chinese, Tibetans, and others. Tibetan Buddhist patronage helped them communicate imperial authority to Mongol subjects. The exact hierarchy expressed in the meeting remains disputed. Tibetan narratives emphasize the reciprocal relationship of priest and patron. Chinese imperial narratives emphasize titles and recognition granted by the emperor. Modern nationalist accounts sometimes project later ideas of sovereignty backward onto a 17th century encounter whose participants operated with different concepts of empire and sacred authority. What is clear is that both rulers needed the meeting. The Qing emperor gained legitimacy among Tibetan Buddhist constituencies. The Dalai Lama gained imperial recognition, gifts, titles, and status extending across Inner Asia. The encounter was neither a simple audience by a subordinate nor a meeting of modern heads of equal nation-states. It was a carefully staged exchange of sacred and imperial prestige. The Fifth's government is sometimes remembered as an uncomplicated golden age of tolerance. The truth is more complex. He possessed genuine ecumenical interests, received and protected Nyingma teachings, and in 1679 formally recognized Bon as a legitimate religious tradition. At the same time, the victorious state curtailed institutions associated with defeated political rivals. Several Yonang monasteries were converted to Gelug use, and political opposition could be suppressed. Religious pluralism existed within a government born from sectarian and regional conflict. That ambiguity defines the Fifth. He was a visionary and politician, a scholar and ruler, a beneficiary of Mongol arms, and an architect of Tibetan central government. He did not merely occupy a throne. He created the system later generations would imagine as ancient. In 1682, the great Fifth died. Then his death became a state secret. The regent Sangye Gyatso concealed it for approximately 15 years. The official explanation was that secrecy allowed completion of the Potala and protected the state from instability. Subjects were told that the Dalai Lama was in prolonged retreat. His ceremonial clothing could be placed on the throne. according to a later institutional account, when Mongol dignitaries demanded an audience, an elderly monk resembling the fifth was disguised to impersonate him. The deception was extraordinary, but it expressed a political truth. The state had become dependent on the continuing presence of the Dalai Lama, even when the man himself was dead. Somewhere beyond Lhasa, his successor had already been found. The boy was being kept in another kind of confinement. He would grow into one of the most beloved and unsettling figures in Tibetan history. 9. The sixth Dalai Lama, Changyang Gyatso, the poet who refused the palace. 1683 to 1706, Changyang Gyatso was born in the Tawang region, now in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, into a family connected with Nyingma traditions. Because the fifth Dalai Lama's death remained secret, the child's identity could not be publicly announced. He was brought to Nankartse, south of Lhasa, and educated under guarded conditions. Imagine the psychological situation. A boy was told that he was the return of a great ruler, yet the world couldn't know that the ruler had died. His predecessor's palace still performed the fiction of continued life. The child was being prepared for an identity whose public existence depended upon secrecy. In 1697, when he was about 14, the truth was finally disclosed. The fifth had been dead since 1682. The boy at Nankartse was his reincarnation. Changyang Gyatso received novice vows from the Panchen Lama and was enthroned in the Potala before Tibetan officials, leading monasteries, Mongol princes, Qing representatives, and the people of Lhasa. He did not become another great fifth. Changyang Gyatso resisted the fully ordained monastic life expected of him. He eventually returned even his novice vows. He wore his hair long, dressed as a layman, drank chang, wandered through Lhasa, practiced archery, and became associated with taverns and lovers. Poems attributed to him speak of desire, secrecy, absence, and the tension between spiritual appearance and human longing. His reputation has often been romanticized. Later readers turned him into a rebel saint, a Himalayan Don Juan, or a tragic poet crushed by religious authority. Some of the poems attributed to him may have been altered, transmitted orally, or added to over time. Still, contemporary and near-contemporary evidence supports the central fact. He rejected the monastic role constructed for him. Was this a spiritual failure, a political protest, a young man's reaction to years of secrecy and control, a tantric mode of conduct, or simply a personality unsuited to celibate office? The answers depend upon the observer. Many Tibetans continued to revere him. His refusal to behave as expected did not necessarily erase belief in his identity. A bodhisattva, after all, need not conform to ordinary assumptions, yet his conduct made him politically vulnerable. The concealed death of the fifth had poisoned relations among the regent Sangye Gyatso, Mongol patrons, and the Qing emperor. Lazang Khan, a descendant of Gushi Khan, defeated and killed Sangye Gyatso in 1705. He then moved against the sixth, accusing him of being an illegitimate or unsuitable Dalai Lama. In 1706, Changyang Gyatso was deposed. He was taken away under Mongol guard, ostensibly toward Beijing. Accounts differ about the exact sequence, including a dramatic tradition that monks at Drepung briefly rescued him before he surrendered to prevent bloodshed. Somewhere near Kokonor, in what is now Qinghai, he died or disappeared. The official date of his death is 1706, but uncertainty produced legends. Some followers claimed that he escaped, traveled secretly, lived for decades, founded religious sites, or died much later in Mongolia. Alternative claimants and biographies circulated. His disappearance transformed political uncertainty into sacred possibility. One poem attributed to him became famous after a child was found in Lithang. White crane, lend me your wings. I go no farther than Lithang, and thence return again. Tibetans later read the lines as a prophecy of his rebirth. Historically, it is safer to say that the poem became prophetic through its relationship to subsequent events. Lhasa Khan installed another young Lama, Yeshe Gyatso, as the true sixth Dalai Lama. Many Tibetans rejected him. The succession was now split. One candidate had been removed, another sat under Mongol protection, and rumors of the vanished poet continued. Then a child appeared in Lithang. His recognition would draw Tibet into a war involving Mongols, Dzungars, Qing armies, and competing Tibetan factions. The white crane was returning to a battlefield. 10. The seventh Dalai Lama, Kelsang Gyatso, the child between empires. 1708 to 1757. Kelsang Gyatso was born at Lithang in 1708, 2 years after the disappearance of Sangyang Gyatso. The location immediately gave his supporters a powerful sign. The sixth poem had named Lithang. The new boy seemed to complete it. But recognizing him was easier than bringing him to Lhasa. Lhasa Khan still ruled in the capital and supported Yeshe Gyatso. The Dzungar Mongols, rivals of the Koshots and enemies of the Qing, saw an opportunity. In 1717, Dzungar forces invaded Tibet, killed Lhasa Khan, and took Lhasa. Some Tibetans initially welcomed them as liberators who might restore the authentic Dalai Lama. The illusion did not last. Dzungar forces plundered, imposed their own authority, and persecuted enemies, including some Nyingma and Bön institutions. They did not immediately install the child from Lithang. The Qing Emperor Kangxi could not tolerate Dzungar control of Tibet. An initial Qing expedition was defeated. A larger campaign followed. In 1720, Qing forces, working with Tibetan allies, expelled the Dzungars and escorted the 12-year-old Kelsang Gyatso to Lhasa, where he was enthroned in the Potala. The rescue had a price. The Qing court now possessed a far stronger military and political presence in Tibetan affairs. Imperial representatives known as ambans would reside in Lhasa. Qing garrisons and regulations expanded or contracted depending on circumstance, but the 18th century relationship could no longer be described as merely the distant exchange of titles between priest and patron. The seventh's religious legitimacy was immense, but his temporal authority was constrained. Tibetan nobles and ministers competed for power. A civil war in 1727 led to the rise of the lay ruler, Polane, who governed with Qing support. Kelsang Gyatso was removed from the immediate center of politics for a time and lived away from Lhasa before returning in the 1730s. The arrangement reveals how misleading the phrase "rule of the Dalai Lamas" can be. A Dalai Lama might sit in the Potala, while a regent, noble, military patron, or imperial representative exercised much of the governing power. The child's body supplied continuity. Others governed around it. Kelsang Gyatso devoted himself substantially to religious study. He received full ordination, mastered sutra and tantra, wrote works of spiritual instruction, and became admired for a life contrasting sharply with the romantic reputation of the sixth. His poems emphasized renunciation, compassion, and transformation of the mind, rather than taverns and lovers. Political crisis returned in 1750. the Tibetan ruler Gyurme Namgyal, son of Polhane, came into conflict with the Qing Ambans in Lhasa. The Ambans assassinated him during a meeting. A violent uprising followed, and the Ambans themselves were killed. Qing forces restored order and punished those held responsible. The settlement of 1751 reorganized the government. The office of Desi, which had concentrated power in a regent administrator, was eliminated. A council of ministers known as the Kashag assumed a central administrative role, while the Dalai Lama stood at the head of the Tibetan government under a structure that also acknowledged Qing imperial oversight. This was neither full Tibetan independence in the modern sense, nor straightforward provincial administration from Beijing. Authority was layered. Tibetan institutions conducted most everyday governance. Qing power became especially visible during wars, succession disputes, and major political crises. The intensity of imperial involvement changed over time. The seventh died in 1757. His life had begun under a rival claimant, passed through a Dungar occupation, and culminated in a government reshaped after assassination and revolt. Yet the religious lineage emerged intact. His successor would preside over another foreign invasion, one that gave the Qing emperor an opening to intervene not merely in government, but in reincarnation itself. 11. The eighth Dalai Lama, Jampel Gyatso, and the coming of the Golden Urn. 1758 to 1804. Jampel Gyatso was born in Tsang in 1758. Recognition narratives describe rainbows, abundant harvests, meditative postures, and the judgment of the Panchen Lama that he was the authentic reincarnation. He was brought to Tashil Hunpo for recognition ceremonies and escorted to Lhasa, where he was enthroned in 1762. He came to maturity in a Tibet, where the formal prestige of the Dalai Lama had increased, but the machinery of regency remained powerful. Demo Rinpoche served as regent during his minority. Like many Dalai Lamas, Jampel Gyatso spent much of his youth inside an educational and ceremonial system, while others administered the state. He received full ordination in 1777. He is associated with the development of the Norbulinka, the park and summer palace complex west of central Lhasa. The Norbulinka would become the warmer season residence of later Dalai Lamas, a place of gardens, pavilions, audiences, government activity, and eventually the beginning of the 14th Dalai Lama's flight in 1959. The 8th was not a dominant political personality like the 5th or 13th. His period is remembered more for events surrounding him, especially the Gurkha Wars. The expanding Gorkha kingdom of Nepal invaded Tibetan territory in 1788. The causes involved disputes over trade, coinage, salt, and the complex financial and family affairs surrounding the late Panchen Lama. Tibetan authorities negotiated a settlement, but failed to fulfill all its terms. A second invasion followed in 1791. Gorkha forces advanced into Tsang and plundered Tashil Hunpo, the Panchen Lama's great monastery. The attack was a shock. Tashil Hunpo was not merely wealthy, it was one of the central sacred and political institutions of Tibet. The Tibetan government appealed to the Qing Emperor Qianlong. A large Qing army entered Tibet, drove the invaders back, crossed into Nepal, and forced a settlement. Qianlong concluded that Tibetan administration and the recognition of high reincarnations required reform. He suspected that aristocratic families and monastic factions manipulated searches to place relatives or allies in valuable incarnation lines. His response became known through the 29 Article Ordinance of 1793. Among its most consequential provisions was a new method for confirming major reincarnations: the Golden Urn. The urn was a gold-plated copper vessel manufactured in the Qing imperial workshops. Names of candidates were placed on slips and drawn before a sacred image. The emperor intended the procedure to regularize selection, reduce factional manipulation, replace or constrain reliance on Tibetan oracles, and make Qing imperial sanction part of the process. A second urn was kept in Beijing for important Mongolian reincarnations. To a modern observer, drawing lots may appear arbitrary. To the Qing court, it combined bureaucratic selection, imperial authority, and divinatory ritual. Tibetan elites gradually incorporated the procedure in some cases, resisted or evaded it in others, and interpreted it in ways compatible with Buddhist sacred causation. The golden urn did not suddenly replace all Tibetan methods. Search parties still investigated signs, dreams, reports, memories, and candidates. The urn came at the end of a process already narrowed by Tibetan institutions. Its actual use varied, and historical records often conflict. The 8th Dalai Lama died in 1804. His death began the most fragile period in the lineage's history. 4 successive Dalai Lamas would die young. Regents would govern for decades. The golden urn would be invoked, avoided, staged, or disputed. Rumors of poisoning would haunt the Potala. For nearly a century, Tibet would possess Dalai Lamas without receiving sustained rule from a mature Dalai Lama. Part 4. The 4 boys in the Potala. 12. The 9th Dalai Lama, Lungtok Gyatso and the English Stranger. 1805 to 1815. Lungtok Gyatso was born in Kham in 1805 and recognized 2 years later as the reincarnation of Jampel Gyatso. His selection was the first Dalai Lama succession after the Golden Urn regulations. Tibetan officials and the Panchen Lama favored him strongly and sought permission to bypass the lottery. The Qing emperor granted an exemption, or, in imperial language, approved recognition without a draw. The distinction would later become politically important. Tibetan narratives treated traditional recognition as decisive. Chinese state narratives emphasized that exemption itself required imperial authorization. The child was escorted to Lhasa and enthroned in 1810. He never came close to assuming political power, yet he left one of the most vivid personal impressions of any early Dalai Lama because of an unexpected visitor. Thomas Manning was an eccentric English mathematician and student of China. In 1811, traveling through Bhutan and Tibet with a Chinese servant, he reached Lhasa. No English visitor would be admitted again until the violent young husband expedition nearly a century later. On December 17th, Manning was brought before the 6-year-old Dalai Lama. The encounter affected him deeply. He sketched the child and wrote that he possessed the simple and unaffected manners of a well-educated princely child. Manning found his face beautiful and emotionally affecting, and confessed that the strangeness of the meeting nearly made him weep. The description is precious because it briefly parts the curtains of ritual. We glimpse not an abstract incarnation, but a cheerful boy being watched by an exhausted foreign traveler who had crossed mountains seeking a route into China. Lungtok Gyatso died in 1815, around 9 or 10 years old. His death deprived the government of even the distant prospect of adult rule. The search had to begin again. A new regent would supervise a new childhood, new enthronement, and new education. The state had been designed around the return of a bodhisattva. It had not solved the political problem created when the bodhisattva repeatedly died before reaching adulthood. 13. The 10th Dalai Lama, Tsultrim Gyatso, and the Disputed Lottery. 1816 to 1837. The 10th Dalai Lama was born in Lithang in 1816, the same region associated with the 7th and with the famous poem of the 6th. Several boys were investigated. Tibetan authorities favored the Lithang child, but disputes over procedure delayed the final confirmation. Qing officials pressed for use of the golden urn. Tibetan historical accounts often maintain that the preferred boy was recognized through traditional means and that the urn was bypassed or reduced to ceremony. Qing and modern Chinese official accounts generally describe the 1822 proceeding as an authentic golden urn selection. The records do not allow complete certainty. That ambiguity is itself revealing. The urn was useful not only when it changed an outcome, but when different authorities could describe the same outcome differently. Tibetan elites could say that the true reincarnation had already manifested through signs. Qing officials could say that imperial procedure had authenticated him. Tsultrim Gyatso was enthroned in 1822 and received novice vows from the Panchen Lama. He entered Drepung for formal study and followed the demanding scholastic curriculum expected of a Dalai Lama. He later took full ordination. The official biographies remember him rebuilding or repairing portions of the Potala. The work had symbolic weight. A Dalai Lama who had not yet fully governed could nevertheless preserve the physical palace of the institution. Architecture outlived the person. He suffered from recurring ill health and died in 1837 at roughly 21. Again, rumors circulated. Sudden death inside a palace invites stories, especially when regents and officials retain power during every minority, yet no persuasive evidence proves that the 10th was murdered. Disease, the medical limitations of the period, arduous ritual schedules, epidemic illness, and the physical conditions of the plateau provide less dramatic but credible explanations. The mystery could not be resolved. The search resumed. 14. The 11th Dalai Lama, Kedrup Gyatso, and the Brief Taste of Power. 1838 to 1856. Kedrup Gyatso was born in 1838 in Kham. Search parties investigated candidates, and his selection appears to have been confirmed through the Golden Urn in 1841. Even here, the procedure was not as impersonal as a lottery suggests. Tibetan authorities had already identified and investigated the child. It is unclear whether the urn held several genuinely competitive names or functioned mainly to ratify a preferred candidate. The ceremony could transform an institutional choice into a divinely and imperially authenticated event. The Panchen Lama cut the child's hair and gave him his religious name. He was enthroned in the Potala in 1842. His upbringing proceeded under a regent, while Tibet confronted regional wars and internal pressures. During his lifetime, Dogra forces from Jammu invaded western Tibet, leading to the Sino-Sikh, or Dogra-Tibetan War, of 1841 to 1842. Soon afterward, conflict erupted between Tibet and Nepal in 1855 to 1856. These wars demonstrated both the geographical vulnerability of Tibet and the limited practical reach of Qing protection during parts of the 19th century. Local Tibetan armies, ministers, monasteries, and regional authorities bore much of the burden. Kedrup Gyatso was allowed to assume political responsibilities while still young. His period of personal authority was brief, too brief to determine what kind of ruler he might have become. He died in the Potala in 1856, probably 17 or 18 years old. A third consecutive Dalai Lama had failed to reach sustained maturity. The political habits of minority government were hardening into a system. Regents, ministerial councils, monastic assemblies, and aristocratic networks did not simply fill occasional gaps. They governed most of the century. The throne remained occupied, but authority continually circled around it. 15. The 12th Dalai Lama, Trinley Gyatso, and the Century of Regents. 1856 to 1875. Trinley Gyatso was born in 1856 near Lhasa. The same year, the 11th died. 3 leading candidates were reportedly brought forward. Tibetan opinion strongly favored Trinley Gyatso. The golden urn was nevertheless used, and the favored child's name emerged. Whether this represented chance, providence, or a managed ceremony cannot be known with confidence. The result allowed every party to preserve its preferred account. Tibetans had found the authentic child. Qing procedure had confirmed him. He was brought to Lhasa, named, ordained as a novice, and enthroned in 1860. His minority occurred amid struggles involving regents, monastic factions, and lay officials. One regent could fall from power and another rise. The great monasteries around Lhasa were not passive religious communities. Their thousands of monks constituted formidable corporate bodies able to influence political outcomes. Trinley Gyatso assumed full political authority in 1873. He was only about 18. 2 years later, he died. 4 successive Dalai Lamas, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, had died at approximately 10, 21, 17, and 19. None had governed long enough to reshape Tibet. The pattern naturally produced suspicion. Later storytellers accused regents, officials, or Qing agents of poisoning the young incarnations. Those who benefited from prolonged minorities certainly had motives to delay a Dalai Lama's assumption of power. But motive is not evidence. The surviving record does not justify confidently declaring the 4 deaths murders. Their cumulative effect is clearer than their individual causes. From the 8th's death in 1804 until the 13th assumed power in 1895, Tibet experienced more than 90 years without sustained personal rule by an adult Dalai Lama. During those decades, the government continued. Taxes were collected. Diplomacy was conducted. Armies fought. Monasteries educated generations of monks. The Panchen Lamas and other hierarchs remained influential. Regents became the practical custodians of the Dalai Lama institution. The repeated childhoods also weakened the capacity for reform. A regency is designed to preserve what exists until the rightful ruler matures. It is rarely designed to remake a state. Tibet entered the age of European imperial expansion, industrial weaponry, global communications, and modern nationalism under a government whose central sacred figure was repeatedly a minor. Then the 13th survived. He would become the first Dalai Lama since the 5th to exercise prolonged personal power, and the last to rule from Lhasa. Part 5. The last ruler of Lhasa. 16. The 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso, and the approaching storm. 1876 to 1933. The 13th Dalai Lama was born in 1876 to a farming family in southern Tibet. The search for him drew upon oracular predictions, observations at his birthplace, consultation with the Panchen Lama, and the ritual repertoire accumulated through centuries of succession. He was recognized in 1877, received his name from the Panchen Lama, and was enthroned in 1879. The golden urn was not used. Qing authorities approved an exemption. Tibetan histories emphasized that there was no need for a lottery because the evidence identifying the child was decisive. Once again, recognition allowed different political narratives to coexist. Thubten Gyatso's early life was shadowed by court intrigue. He received the standard monastic education, but remained under regency. In the 1880s, Tibet faced a British expedition in Sikkim and increasing pressure from the expanding British Indian Empire. The Qing court claimed authority over Tibet, but often lacked the capacity to direct events there. British officials alternately treated China as Tibet's sovereign, suzerain, or ineffective intermediary, depending on strategic convenience. The young Dalai Lama did not assume political authority until 1895, when he was about 19. Unlike his four predecessors, he survived the transition. According to later accounts, plots involving ritual magic or hostile court factions were uncovered around the time of his accession. A prominent regent fell from power. Whatever the precise truth of these accusations, the 13th learned early that the Potala could be as dangerous as any battlefield. He was intelligent, austere, politically alert, and capable of decisive action. Yet he inherited a state with limited military technology, little direct knowledge of the outside world, and powerful institutions resistant to change. The first great crisis came from British India. The British march to Lhasa. At the turn of the 20th century, British officials became obsessed with the possibility of Russian influence in Tibet. A Buryat Mongol Lama named Agvan Dorjiev, one of the Dalai Lama's teachers and envoys, had traveled to Russia. British imperial strategists interpreted his activity through the Great Game, the rivalry between Britain and Russia in Central Asia. Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India, demanded negotiations. When Tibetan authorities refused or delayed, Curzon sent a mission under Colonel Francis Younghusband. What began as diplomacy backed by troops became an invasion. In 1904, more than 8,000 British and Indian troops, supported by modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery, advanced into Tibet. Tibetan defenders carried obsolete firearms, swords, matchlocks, and religious protections. At Guru, British-led forces killed hundreds of Tibetans in a horribly unequal confrontation. The expedition continued toward Lhasa. The 13th Dalai Lama fled at night, traveling north toward Mongolia. He left officials and the Ganden Tripper to negotiate. Younghusband entered Lhasa and imposed a treaty requiring indemnities and trade concessions. For the Dalai Lama, exile became an education. He saw Mongolia, encountered Russian representatives, and gained a clearer understanding of the international world pressing upon Tibet. The journey also taught him an unforgiving lesson. Neither sacred status nor geographical isolation could stop an industrial army. Britain soon reduced some of the harsher terms it had imposed, partly because London feared provoking Russia and did not want to assume the costs of occupying Tibet. Britain then concluded agreements with China and Russia concerning Tibet without meaningful Tibetan participation. Imperial powers treated Tibet as an object in their diplomacy, even while admitting that Qing officials had been unable to prevent the British march to Lhasa. The audience in Beijing. The Dalai Lama later traveled to China and reached Beijing in 1908. The Qing court was itself in crisis, struggling with internal reform, foreign pressure, and revolutionary movements. Questions of ceremony became political. Would the Dalai Lama perform the prostrations expected of an imperial subject? Would he be received as a foreign ruler, a religious hierarch, or a subordinate official? The court granted titles but sought to frame his status beneath imperial authority. The encounter did not restore trust. Qing officials were moving toward a more direct and centralized policy in Tibetan regions, especially under the feared General Zhao Erfeng. Monasteries and local rulers in Kham faced military campaigns, administrative restructuring, and violence. The Dalai Lama returned to Lhasa in late 1909. Qing troops followed. In February 1910, a Chinese force entered the capital. The Dalai Lama fled again, this time south to British India. The Qing court declared him deposed. For the institution of reincarnation, deposition was a strange concept. An emperor could revoke a title or office, but could he revoke a rebirth? The declaration showed the limits of political authority when confronting sacred identity. To believers, Thubten Gyatso did not cease to be the Dalai Lama because Beijing issued an edict. In India, he encountered British colonial society at close range. He saw telegraphs, organized armies, modern schools, bureaucratic administration, mechanized transport, and global communications. British officials who once viewed him as an obstacle now received him as a displaced leader. Then, in 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. Return to an independent Lhasa. Revolution in China shattered imperial authority. Tibetan forces in Lhasa fought the remaining Qing garrison. Chinese troops eventually surrendered and departed. The Dalai Lama returned to Tibet in January 1913. The following month, he issued a proclamation explaining that the earlier relationship between Tibet and the Manchu emperors had been one of priest and patron, not subordination. He condemned recent attempts by Qing officials to colonize Tibetan territory and affirmed the restoration of Tibetan authority. The precise legal meaning of the 1913 proclamation remains debated. Tibetans regard it as a declaration or reassertion of independence. The Republic of China never accepted Tibetan separation. Foreign governments generally avoided full formal recognition, even when dealing with Tibet as a self-governing entity. In practical terms, Central Tibet governed itself from 1912 until the arrival of the People's Liberation Army in 1950 to 1951. Lhasa maintained its own government, army, currency, taxation, postal system, and foreign contacts. Chinese officials did not administer everyday affairs in central Tibet, yet Tibet's international position remained precarious because major powers stopped short of recognizing it as an unambiguously sovereign state. The 1914 Simla Conference attempted to resolve relations among British India, Tibet, and China. Negotiators developed the distinction between inner and outer Tibet and discussed boundaries, including the line later known as the McMahon Line between Tibet and British India. The Chinese representative initialed but didn't ratify the final convention. The conference therefore failed to produce a settlement accepted by all parties. Tibet had achieved de facto autonomy without secure international guarantees. The 13th understood that isolation was no longer protection. The struggle to modernize. He introduced paper currency and new coinage, established a postal system, supported telegraph connections, reorganized aspects of taxation, and attempted to improve the army. He sent 4 Tibetan boys to England for technical education. He supported a medical and astrological institute and experimented with secular schooling. These reforms were not an attempt to make Tibet Western. They were an attempt to preserve Tibetan religion and government by acquiring enough modern capacity to resist conquest. The distinction mattered. The 13th did not believe that Buddhism required military weakness. Compassion did not forbid defensive preparation. Monastic civilization, in his view, could not survive if the state protecting it remained technologically helpless. But every reform threatened an interest. A modern army required money, conscription, equipment, and centralized command. New taxes alarmed estates and monasteries. Secular education appeared to compete with monastic learning. Foreign-trained students returned with skills that did not fit easily into established offices. Aristocrats feared loss of privilege. Monastic leaders feared that militarization and imported customs would erode the Dharma. The result was partial modernization. Some reforms endured, others were weakened, reversed, or abandoned. A dispute with the 9th Panchen Lama became especially damaging. Tashil Hunpo resisted financial demands connected with military reform. Relations deteriorated until the Panchen Lama fled Tibet in 1923 and lived in Chinese-controlled territory. The two great Gelug incarnation lines, meant to recognize and educate one another, became caught in the fiscal and geopolitical struggle between Lhasa and China. The 13th was therefore both reformer and conservative ruler. He strengthened the army, but would not dismantle the monastic order. He wanted technical knowledge without cultural surrender. He centralized authority, but depended on institutions suspicious of centralization. His greatest fear was time. He had witnessed British guns cut through Tibetan defenders. He had watched Qing forces enter Lhasa. He had seen the Manchu Empire collapse and a Chinese republic continue to claim Tibet. He knew that no mountain range could permanently exclude modern power. Near the end of his life, he issued a warning to officials, monks, and laypeople. It has often been treated as prophecy, but it was also a political diagnosis. He wrote, "I foresee that the means of happiness in Tibet will last as long as I live." He warned that selfishness, factionalism, and failure to prepare would bring suffering after his death. Thubten Gyatso died on December 17, 1933. His body was installed in the Potala. The government passed to a regent. The search for a child began. Outside Tibet, the forces he had feared were already gathering. Japan had invaded Manchuria. Chinese civil conflict continued. Communism was advancing. British India remained the dominant power south of the Himalayas, but would not remain indefinitely. The 13th had given Tibet time. He had not been able to guarantee what Tibet would do with it. Part 6. The Dalai Lama of the World. 17. The 14th Dalai Lama, from Taktsa to the Potala. Born 1935. Lamo Thondup was born on July 6, 1935, in Taktsa, a small farming settlement in Amdo. His parents grew barley, buckwheat, and potatoes. The region lay far from the direct authority of Lhasa and within a complicated political landscape of Tibetan monasteries, Chinese provincial claims, Muslim military rulers, and local networks. The boy's family was not entirely untouched by the Tulku system. An older brother had already been recognized as Taktsa Rinpoche. Still, the possibility that another child in the household might be the Dalai Lama was, in the 14th's own recollection, nearly unimaginable. The traditional recognition story combined signs surrounding the 13th Dalai Lama's body, the regent's vision at Lamo Latso, architectural clues, dreams, divination, personal recognition, and the object test at the farmhouse. The child's journey to Lhasa required negotiation and payment to regional authorities. Once the party was free to depart, the caravan traveled for approximately 3 months. The boy entered Lhasa in October 1939 and was enthroned in February 1940. His childhood changed abruptly. The Potala contained immense halls, chapels, tombs, government offices, storerooms, stairways, and dark passages. It was less a home than a sacred state in architectural form. The young Dalai Lama received instruction in Buddhist philosophy, logic, monastic discipline, metaphysics, epistemology, Sanskrit grammar, medicine, poetry, astrology, composition, and ritual. His education followed the Nalanda-derived curriculum developed in Tibet's monastic universities. Debate trained him to defend propositions under relentless questioning. He was also a curious child, fascinated by mechanical objects. He dismantled and repaired watches, examined cameras, used telescopes, and became interested in automobiles and electrical systems. This curiosity later contributed to his sustained engagement with scientists. The symbolic contrast is striking. The child believed to embody an ancient bodhisattva wanted to know how machines worked. His education unfolded amid regency politics. Reting Rinpoche, who had overseen the search, resigned as regent in 1941 and was succeeded by Taktra Rinpoche. A later attempt by Reting to regain power ended in arrest and death in custody in 1947. His supporters at Sera Monastery rebelled, and government forces suppressed them. The episode reminded Tibet that political conflict could erupt within the religious establishment itself. Monks could be scholars, contemplatives, estate administrators, political organizers, or armed partisans. The romantic image of an entirely peaceful old Tibet cannot survive serious history. Nor can the opposite caricature of Tibet as nothing but an oppressive, feudal theocracy. Pre-1950. Tibet possessed profound inequalities, hereditary estates, indebted peasants, corporal punishments, and highly stratified political power. It also possessed functioning local communities, monastic education, sophisticated philosophy, art, medicine, pilgrimage, and forms of social and religious life that cannot be reduced to one ideological label. The boy in the Potala inherited all of it. In October 1950, the People's Liberation Army defeated Tibetan forces at Chamdo in eastern Tibet. The regency ended. At 15, Tenzin Gyatso was asked to rule. 18. The collision with Mao's China. The Chinese Communist Party had proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. Its leaders declared that Tibet was part of China and that it would be liberated from imperialist influence and the old social order. For the Tibetan government, the language of liberation concealed invasion. For the new Chinese state, military entry into Tibet completed national reunification after decades of foreign encroachment and civil war. The disagreement was not merely semantic. It concerned who possessed the right to define Tibet's political status and future. Following the fall of Chamdo, the Tibetan National Assembly urged the Dalai Lama to assume full temporal authority. He did so on November 17, 1950, years earlier than custom normally required. He was 15. He temporarily moved toward Dromo, near the Indian frontier, while a Tibetan delegation traveled to Beijing. On May 23, 1951, the delegates signed the 17-point agreement. The agreement affirmed Chinese sovereignty while promising regional autonomy, protection of the Dalai Lama's position, preservation of the existing political system, and respect for religious beliefs and monasteries. The Tibetan government later argued that its representatives had acted under military coercion and without authority to conclude such an agreement. Chinese accounts portray the document as the peaceful agreement by which Tibet returned to the motherland. The Dalai Lama initially chose accommodation rather than immediate repudiation. He returned to Lhasa. The alternative seemed to be a war Tibet could not win, and for which no foreign government was willing to provide decisive support. PLA units entered Lhasa in late 1951. For a time, Tibetan and Chinese institutions existed uneasily beside one another. The Dalai Lama remained in the Potala and Norbolinka. Tibetan officials retained offices. Monasteries continued their activities. Chinese cadres promised gradual reform. The young ruler tried to understand the revolution that had arrived at his door. In 1954, he traveled to Beijing with the Panchen Lama. He met Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and other leaders. He attended sessions of the National People's Congress and was appointed to official positions within the new Chinese political system. The Dalai Lama later recalled being impressed by some communist ideals, especially their stated concern for equality and the poor. Buddhism and Marxism offered radically different metaphysics, but both criticized greed and exploitation. He hoped socialist reform might be reconciled with Tibetan culture and religion. His meetings with Mao became part of modern Tibetan legend. In the Dalai Lama's account, Mao treated him with warmth and intelligence, but eventually remarked that religion was poison. Whether remembered verbatim or not, the sentiment captured the ideological gulf between them. For the Dalai Lama, religion could be examined, reformed, and freed from superstition, but it remained a profound method for transforming the mind. For the Communist Party, institutional religion was associated with feudal privilege, false consciousness, and resistance to revolutionary change. The conflict intensified first in Kham and Amdo. These regions were incorporated into Chinese provinces and autonomous areas, rather than administered as part of the later Tibet autonomous region. Reforms, land redistribution, collectivization, attacks on local elites, and interference with monasteries provoked resistance. Armed revolts spread. Chinese military repression drove refugees and fighters toward central Tibet. The distinction between gradual policy in central Tibet and rapid transformation in eastern Tibetan regions became increasingly impossible to sustain. Refugees brought stories of monasteries destroyed, lamas arrested, property seized, and communities bombed. Resistance fighters organized networks later associated with the Chushi Gangdruk movement. The United States Central Intelligence Agency eventually provided limited covert assistance, but it was never sufficient to defeat China and was driven partly by Cold War strategy rather than a commitment to Tibetan independence. In 1956, the Dalai Lama traveled to India for celebrations marking 2,500 years since the Buddha's parinirvana. There, he met Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Zhou Enlai. He considered remaining outside Tibet. Nehru advised him to return and seek implementation of the agreement. He returned. For 2 more years, he continued his studies while trying to mediate between an increasingly distrustful Tibetan population and Chinese authorities. In February 1959, amid the crisis, he completed the rigorous examinations for the Geshe Larampa degree, the highest scholastic qualification in the Gelug monastic system. The philosopher passed his examinations just before the state collapsed around him. 19. March 1959, the night the Dalai Lama vanished. On March 10, 1959, thousands of Tibetans surrounded the Norbolinka. Chinese military officials had invited the Dalai Lama to attend a theatrical performance at their headquarters. Rumors spread that he would be required to come without his usual guards, and that the Chinese planned to abduct him. Whether such a kidnapping was actually intended remains uncertain. What mattered was that the people believed it. Crowds gathered to prevent him from leaving. Tibetan officials were denounced as collaborators. Demonstrators called for Chinese withdrawal and Tibetan independence. The uprising acquired a momentum no single leader controlled. Inside the Norbolinka, the Dalai Lama and his ministers faced impossible choices. Remaining might lead to capture or death. Leaving could trigger violence and appear to abandon the capital. Negotiation had nearly collapsed. On March 15th, Chinese artillery shells landed near the palace. On March 17th, after consultations with the state oracle and government officials, the Dalai Lama decided to escape. At night, he removed his monastic robes and dressed as an ordinary soldier. A rifle was slung over his shoulder. Accompanied by family members, ministers, tutors, guards, and officials, he slipped out of the Norbolinka and crossed the river. The escape party moved through territory held by Tibetan resistance forces. They traveled at night, crossed mountain passes, endured storms, and avoided Chinese patrols. For days, the world didn't know whether the Dalai Lama was alive, captured, or dead. Chinese artillery struck areas of Lhasa, including the vicinity of the Norbolinka. The uprising was crushed, monasteries were shelled or occupied, and large numbers of Tibetans were killed, imprisoned, or displaced. Exact casualty figures remain disputed and politically charged, but the destruction of the old government is not. On March 31st, after a 14-day journey, the Dalai Lama crossed into India. Prime Minister Nehru granted him asylum. At Lhasa Dzong, during the escape, the Tibetan government had repudiated the 17-point agreement. The Dalai Lama publicly confirmed the repudiation after reaching India. He was 23 years old. Behind him, the Ganden Phodrang government, that had ruled from Lhasa since 1642, ceased to function inside Tibet. Democratic reforms, collectivization, campaigns against religion, and later the Cultural Revolution transformed the plateau. Thousands of monasteries and religious objects were destroyed during the following decades, although the intensity and timing varied by region. Monks and nuns were forced to disrobe. Religious teaching went underground or into exile. Ahead lay uncertainty. The Dalai Lama possessed no army capable of returning him to Tibet, no foreign state willing to wage war on his behalf, and no guarantee that Tibetan civilization could survive outside its homeland. Exile appeared to be the defeat of the institution. Instead, it became the beginning of its global life. 20. Building Tibet outside Tibet. The Dalai Lama first resided in Mussoorie and then moved in 1960 to Dharamsala, a hill town in northern India. The Indian government provided refuge, but Tibetans had to create communities, schools, monasteries, offices, and livelihoods in unfamiliar climates. Refugees worked on road crews in the Himalayan foothills, established agricultural settlements in southern India, and rebuilt monastic institutions in exile. The physical hardship was severe. Tibetans accustomed to the dry plateau faced heat, disease, and displacement. Elderly monks who had spent lives in high-altitude monasteries found themselves clearing land in tropical settlements. The Dalai Lama recognized that political preservation depended upon cultural preservation. A government without territory could not survive merely by issuing proclamations. Children had to learn Tibetan. Monks had to be trained. Texts had to be recopied. Ritual lineages had to be transmitted before elderly masters died. Schools were therefore among the first priorities. So were the re-established monasteries of Sera, Drepung, Ganden, Tashilhunpo, and institutions belonging to Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, Burn, and other traditions. The diaspora accomplished something historically extraordinary. It transplanted a complex civilization across borders. Monastic universities that had developed over centuries in Tibet were reconstructed in India. Teachers who had once been inaccessible to outsiders began instructing students from Europe, the Americas, East Asia, and Australia. Texts were translated into modern languages. Tibetan Buddhism became global. This expansion changed the tradition. Teachings once given within highly specific ritual and monastic settings were adapted for lay audiences. Meditation was presented in psychological language. Compassion, interdependence, and training the mind became accessible points of entry. Some Western students romanticized Tibet or stripped practices from their ethical and doctrinal contexts. Others undertook decades of serious study and helped preserve endangered texts. The Dalai Lama became the most visible interpreter of this transition. He was able to speak in several registers. To monks, he could teach intricate Madhyamaka philosophy, debate interpretations of emptiness, and confer tantric initiations. To interfaith audiences, he spoke of compassion and religious harmony. To secular audiences, he emphasized ethics, human affection, and mental training without requiring Buddhist belief. This universality did not mean he ceased being a traditional Tibetan Lama. He maintained monastic vows, performed rituals, consulted oracles, received transmissions, and taught esoteric practices. His global modernity and Tibetan religiosity existed together. 21. Democracy against reincarnate rule. The exile administration initially reproduced aspects of the old Ganden Phodrang structure, but the 14th Dalai Lama increasingly argued that the political future of Tibet should not depend upon one reincarnate Lama. In 1963, he presented a draft democratic constitution. An elected assembly developed. Subsequent reforms increased representation, established judicial structures, and shifted the selection of ministers away from direct appointment by the Dalai Lama. In 2001, Tibetans in exile directly elected their chief executive. The transformation culminated in 2011. The Dalai Lama announced that he would relinquish his remaining formal political authority to the democratically elected leadership of the Central Tibetan administration. His decision ended the system of dual spiritual and temporal authority established under the fifth nearly 370 years earlier. The Dalai Lama explained that hereditary and religious rule no longer suited the modern world. In one of his clearest formulations, he declared, "The rule by kings and religious figures is outdated." He insisted that the transfer was not an abandonment of Tibet, but a means of protecting the Tibetan cause from dependence upon one individual. The irony was profound. The fifth Dalai Lama had used sacred authority to construct a government. The 14th used sacred authority to dismantle his own political office. This was more than personal modesty. The succession system creates unavoidable political gaps. A Dalai Lama dies. Years may pass before a child is found. More years pass before he is educated. In the modern world, a government cannot suspend sovereign decision-making for 2 decades while searching for and tutoring a toddler. By separating spiritual lineage from political administration, the 14th attempted to preserve both. The elected government could continue during the transition between incarnations. The future Dalai Lama would not automatically inherit executive power over Tibetans. Whether this democratic system can maintain legitimacy among Tibetans inside Tibet, who cannot freely participate in its elections, remains a difficult question. But the transfer ensured that the next succession would concern spiritual leadership and national symbolism rather than formal control of an exile government. 22. The Nobel Laureate and the Middle Way. During the 1960s and 1970s, the Dalai Lama remained primarily known as the exiled leader of Tibet. Over time, he became an international moral figure. He traveled to Japan and Thailand in 1967 and made his first extended journey to the West in 1973. He met religious leaders, politicians, scientists, students, activists, and ordinary audiences. His combination of humor, philosophical seriousness, monastic simplicity, and political tragedy made him unusually compelling. He did not seek Tibetan independence through armed struggle. By the late 20th century, he advocated what became known as the middle way approach, genuine autonomy for Tibetan areas within the People's Republic of China, with meaningful protection for language, religion, culture, education, and the environment. Critics emerged on both sides. Chinese authorities continued to portray him as a separatist, using autonomy as a disguise for independence. Some Tibetans, especially younger activists, argued that the middle way surrendered Tibet's legitimate claim to sovereignty without obtaining concessions. The Dalai Lama maintained that non-violence was both ethical and practical. China could not be defeated militarily by Tibetans. Hatred of Chinese people would corrupt the Tibetan cause and confuse a government's policies with an entire civilization. In 1987, he presented a 5-point peace plan in Washington. In 1988 at Strasbourg, he proposed a framework for Tibetan self-government associated with China. Beijing rejected his initiatives as insufficient or insincere. In 1989, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his non-violent struggle and his advocacy of peaceful resolution. The award transformed his international position. He became one of the world's best-known religious figures, compared with Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. His image appeared in homes, temples, universities, government offices, films, and popular culture. Global fame brought simplification. The Dalai Lama was often presented as the smiling apostle of kindness, detached from the dense, scholastic, ritual, and historical world that formed him. Compassion became a slogan rather than a disciplined Mahayana commitment rooted in understanding suffering, emptiness, and the Bodhisattva path. Yet his achievement should not be underestimated. He translated central Buddhist insights into a language that millions outside Tibet could hear without pretending that all religions were identical. He argued that one could respect other traditions while remaining deeply committed to one's own. He met popes, rabbis, Hindu teachers, Muslim leaders, Christian monks, scientists, and atheists. The institution that began with a Gelug scholar in Chang had become a global platform for religious pluralism. 23. The monk and the scientists. The 14th Dalai Lama's interest in science grew from childhood curiosity into one of the most consequential dialogues between a major religious tradition and modern research. He met physicists, neuroscientists, psychologists, biologists, and philosophers of mind. Through sustained exchanges, including the mind and life dialogues, Buddhist contemplatives and scientists explored attention, emotion, neuroplasticity, meditation, sleep, compassion, and consciousness. The Dalai Lama repeatedly distinguished Buddhist empirical investigation from unquestioning attachment to scripture. He argued that where well-established scientific evidence contradicts traditional Buddhist cosmology, Buddhists should accept the evidence. This did not mean that science and Buddhism were simply saying the same thing. Science generally brackets metaphysical claims about rebirth and karma that cannot be experimentally tested. Buddhist philosophy examines first-person experience and ethical transformation in ways not reducible to brain imaging. The significance lay in the willingness to expose inherited ideas to disciplined inquiry. Monastics in exile began studying basic science. Researchers investigated meditation practices. Popular enthusiasm sometimes outran the evidence, producing exaggerated claims that meditation could cure nearly anything. But serious collaboration also generated valuable research into attention, stress, compassion training, and emotional regulation. This scientific engagement continued the intellectual spirit of the monastic debate courtyard. The method had changed. The willingness to ask how one knows had not. The Dalai Lama's authority made such engagement possible without requiring Tibetan Buddhists to abandon their identity. He could say, in effect, that examining a claim was not betrayal. It was part of the Buddhist path. 24. What the Dalai Lama is and is not. The global prominence of the 14th Dalai Lama has produced several persistent misunderstandings. He is not the Buddhist equivalent of the Pope. Buddhism has no single worldwide head. Theravada, East Asian Mahayana, Zen, Pure Land, Nichiren, Tibetan Vajrayana, and many other traditions possess their own institutions and teachers. He is not technically the administrative head of the Gelug school. That position belongs to the Ganden Tripa, the holder of Tsongkhapa's throne. The office is attained through monastic scholarship and appointment rather than reincarnation. Nor is he the ruler of all Tibetan Buddhist schools. The Karmapa line possesses its own authority in the Karma Kagyu tradition. Sakya leadership has historically been associated with the Kun family and its hierarchs. Nyingma institutions have their own leading masters. Bon maintains its own lineages and monasteries. The Dalai Lama's larger authority developed historically. He became head of the Ganden Phodrang government under the 5th, a symbol of Tibet across regional and sectarian divisions, and, under the 14th, the internationally recognized face of Tibetan identity. Tibetans may revere him as Gyalwa Rinpoche, the precious victor, or Kundun, the presence. Many regard him as an emanation of Chenrezig, Avalokiteshvara, whose compassion is intimately connected with Tibet. That belief is theological, not merely honorary. In Tibetan Buddhist understanding, an emanation need not be a permanently existing soul moving unchanged between bodies. Buddhism denies such an eternal self. The continuity is instead explained through causal consciousness, intention, karmic connection, and compassionate activity. The philosophical paradox is central. The Dalai Lama is treated as the continuation of previous lives within a religion, teaching that no independent, unchanging self can be found. Reincarnation, in this view, is not the migration of a metaphysical personality substance. It is continuity without identity in the simplistic sense, like one flame lighting another, causally connected, but not numerically identical. This subtle doctrine was converted by history into a highly visible human institution. The office required one child to bear the memories, expectations, political symbolism, and unfinished work of 14 lives. Part 7. How a Dalai Lama is chosen. 25. Death, signs, search, recognition, and installation. Across the 14 lives, there has never been one unchanging selection formula. Procedures evolved as the institution acquired political importance. The process traditionally begins before or immediately after death. A Dalai Lama may leave indications about his future birth. Attendants observe the position of the body, the direction of the face, unusual clouds, smoke, dreams, or events at the time of cremation. Oracles may be consulted. Senior lamas and the regent interpret signs. The regent historically played an especially powerful role because he governed during the interval between Dalai Lamas. He could oversee the search, dispatch parties, receive reports, manage rival claims, negotiate with regional authorities, and arrange the recognized child's journey to Lhasa. The Nechung oracle, the principal state oracle of the Ganden Phodrang, might be consulted. During a trance, the medium donned elaborate armor and entered an altered state interpreted as possession by the protector Pehar or his minister Dorje Drakten. Answers could be cryptic and required interpretation. Sacred lakes, especially Lamo Latso, served as visionary sites. A regent or lama might perceive letters, buildings, paths, landscapes, or directions in the water. These visions narrowed the geographical field but rarely supplied a street address. Search parties then investigated children born near the appropriate time. They listened to rumors of unusual behavior. A child might speak of Lhasa, recognize a monastery, insist that objects belonged to him, or display unexpected familiarity with former attendants. Promising candidates could be tested with rosaries, walking sticks, drums, spectacles, bowls, or other possessions belonging to the deceased Dalai Lama, mixed with copies. The child's choices were interpreted alongside the wider body of evidence. Senior lamas then confirmed the candidate. The Panchen Lama often performed important functions, although the exact relationship varied according to politics and the ages of the two figures. The child's hair was cut, he received a religious name, and he took lay or novice vows. Recognition did not immediately make him ruler. The child had to be transported to Lhasa, a journey that could require negotiations with local chiefs, foreign governments, military authorities, or families reluctant to surrender him. Enthronement took place amid elaborate ritual. Representatives of monasteries, government offices, aristocratic families, regional authorities, and foreign powers might attend. The child was placed physically within the lineage through robes, throne, seals, relics, titles, and prayers. His education then began. Tutors controlled access and designed a curriculum extending through adolescence. A Dalai Lama studied canonical texts, logic, debate, ritual, monastic discipline, philosophy, poetry, medicine, and administration. He received novice and eventually full monastic vows, except in the extraordinary case of the sixth. During minority, a regent governed. Upon maturity, political authority was ceremonially transferred when circumstances permitted. The recognition process combined revelation with administration. Even a miraculous child required caravans, documents, guards, money, diplomatic clearance, teachers, estates, and a government capable of presenting him to the public. 26. The Golden Urn and the Battle over History. The Golden Urn is now at the center of the coming succession dispute because it embodies two very different historical arguments. The Qing emperor introduced the urn after the Gurkha Wars of the 1790s. His government claimed a duty to regularize major reincarnation searches and prevent corruption. Names of candidates were to be placed in the vessel and drawn through ritual. Historical research shows that the urn was neither wholly irrelevant nor consistently decisive. It was used for numerous Tibetan and Mongolian reincarnation lines and became part of Qing administrative practice. Tibetan elites sometimes accepted and ritualized it. At other times, they sought exemptions, limited the field to one preferred candidate, or may have managed proceedings so that the desired result emerged. For the Dalai Lamas specifically, the historical picture is mixed. The ninth was recognized without a draw, though the Qing emperor formally approved the exemption. The 10th's case is disputed. Qing and later Chinese records describe urn use. Tibetan accounts often deny that a genuine lottery determined the outcome. The 11th appears to have been confirmed through the urn, although perhaps with only one meaningful candidate. The 12th was selected through an urn ceremony in which the child already favored by Tibetan authorities emerged. The 13th was recognized without it. The 14th was also recognized without it, although the nationalist Chinese government later sought to present its approval as legally significant. These facts do not support the extreme claim that the golden urn was merely fictional and never mattered. Nor do they support the opposite claim that no Dalai Lama was legitimate without central government selection. The Qing Empire was a multi-ethnic dynastic empire ruled by Manchus. Its concepts of sovereignty, patronage, and imperial authority were not identical to those of the modern People's Republic of China. As historian Max Oitman has emphasized, projecting 20th and 21st century nationalism backward can distort both Tibetan and Qing history. After the Qing collapsed in 1911, the urn largely ceased to function as an active institution. The People's Republic revived it prominently in 1995 during the disputed recognition of the 11th Panchen Lama. The Dalai Lama recognized Gedun Chuekyi Nyima. Chinese authorities rejected that choice, took the child into custody, and installed Gyanken Norbu after a golden urn ceremony. Gedun Chuekyi Nyma's whereabouts and freedom have remained subjects of international concern. That precedent makes the coming Dalai Lama succession especially dangerous. Beijing has both a regulatory framework and a state-recognized Panchen Lama who could participate in recognizing a future Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama's exiled institution has its own Panchen claimant and rejects Beijing's authority. History therefore points toward the possibility of two 15th Dalai Lamas, one recognized by Tibetan authorities associated with the current Dalai Lama, perhaps born outside PRC control, and another selected within China under state supervision. That outcome is not inevitable, but it is a reasonable inference from the rival claims already publicly established. Part 8. The Empty Throne Ahead. 27. The 14th Dalai Lama's Decision. For years, the Dalai Lama left open several possibilities. The institution might end. He might emanate before death. A successor might be female. The next Dalai Lama might be born outside Tibet or outside territory controlled by China. He might leave written instructions. Such statements were sometimes interpreted as whimsical improvisations. In fact, they addressed a genuine theological and political question. If a bodhisattva returns voluntarily for the benefit of beings, why must a government dictate the manner of that return? In his May 21, 2025 statement, released publicly in July, the Dalai Lama resolved the first question. I am affirming that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue. He assigned sole recognition authority to the Garden Phodrang Trust and instructed it to consult the heads of Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the customary oath-bound protectors connected with the lineage. He explicitly rejected outside interference. The declaration did not identify a child, birthplace, gender, or exact procedure. It did, however, establish a line of institutional succession before his death. Beijing immediately restated its own position. Chinese authorities insist that reincarnate lamas must follow state-approved procedures, including search within China, use of the golden urn, and approval by the central government. The disagreement exposes the strangest paradox in the entire history. The government of the People's Republic of China is officially atheist and historically conducted devastating campaigns against Tibetan religious institutions, yet it claims the legal power to authenticate the reincarnation of a bodhisattva. From Beijing's perspective, this is not about accepting Buddhist metaphysics. It is about sovereignty, law, historical precedent, and political stability. The Dalai Lama has been the central symbol of Tibetan resistance and identity. Allowing an uncontrolled reincarnation would create a charismatic authority beyond the party's reach. From the Tibetan perspective associated with the current Dalai Lama, a state cannot manufacture spiritual legitimacy. Government recognition may create official ceremonies, institutions, media coverage, and access to monasteries, but it cannot compel belief. Both sides understand that the next Dalai Lama will be a child. Both are preparing institutions to speak through that child. 28. Can a reincarnation be controlled? The history of the Dalai Lamas suggests that political power can shape reincarnation institutions, but never control them completely. Mongol patronage created the title, but the title outlived Mongol dominance. Gushi Khan's armies placed the fifth in power, but the Ganden Phodrang became more than a Koshot puppet. Lhasa Khan deposed the sixth and installed another candidate, but most Tibetans rejected the replacement. The Dzungars captured Lhasa, but failed to create a legitimate succession. Qing armies escorted the seventh to the Potala and later imposed the Golden Urn, yet Tibetan authorities continued to rely on their own recognition traditions. The Qing court deposed the 13th in 1910, but his identity survived the edict, and he returned after the dynasty fell. The People's Republic took control of Tibet, but the 14th Dalai Lama rebuilt his institutions in exile and acquired greater global visibility than any predecessor. Political authorities can control monasteries, travel, education, media, and enthronement ceremonies. They can confine one claimant and promote another. They can reward obedience and punish dissent. But recognition ultimately depends upon communities of belief. A Dalai Lama with no followers is an official title. A Dalai Lama believed in by millions can remain powerful without territory. This does not guarantee that the exile-recognized successor will prevail. Tibetans inside China live under conditions in which public rejection of a state candidate may be dangerous. Generational change, language loss, migration, economic transformation, surveillance, and the weakening of monastic institutions may alter how future Tibetans understand the lineage. Nor is the diaspora immune to fragmentation. Competing religious leaders, regional communities, political factions, and governments may disagree. A prolonged minority could reduce momentum. A child born in Europe, India, Mongolia, Bhutan, Nepal, or the Himalayan borderlands might face questions about culture, language, citizenship, and authenticity. The next succession may therefore test whether the Dalai Lama institution can remain transnational without becoming detached from Tibet itself. Epilogue. 14 lives, one unfinished story. The first Dalai Lama built a monastery. The second made the monastery's teacher into a reincarnation line. The third crossed the steppe and received an oceanic title from a Mongol Khan. The fourth was born into the Mongol world that had patronized his predecessor. The fifth used Mongol victory to create a government and raised the Potala above Lhasa. The sixth walked out of monastic expectation and into poetry, taverns, romance, deposition, and legend. The seventh entered Lhasa behind Qing armies and governed amid imperial intervention. The eighth witnessed war with Nepal and the birth of the Golden Urn. The ninth charmed an English traveller and died as a child. The 10th studied and rebuilt while arguments over imperial procedure surrounded his recognition. The 11th touched political power only briefly. The 12th died just after assuming it. The 13th fled 2 empires, returned to a self-governing Tibet, attempted modernization, and warned that catastrophe would follow complacency. The 14th lost his country, carried its institutions into exile, became a Nobel laureate, opened Tibetan Buddhism to the world, and voluntarily ended the political system the 5th had created. No simple theory explains all 14. The institution cannot be reduced to a fraud devised by monks, because its recognitions repeatedly crossed family, class, regional and ethnic boundaries in ways that created genuine risk for those involved. It cannot be treated as untouched divine continuity, because every recognition occurred through human institutions vulnerable to influence, ambition, fear, and error. It cannot be called merely Tibetan, because Mongol patrons gave it its title, Manchu emperors shaped its political environment, Indian refuge preserved its modern life, and global audiences transformed its reach. It cannot be called simply Gelug, because several Dalai Lamas studied, practiced, or protected teachings outside Gelug institutions, and the office eventually became a symbol extending across Tibetan traditions. It cannot be described as an unbroken line of rulers, because the first 4 did not rule Tibet. 4 others died young, regents frequently governed, and the 14th relinquished political power. What unites the lineage is not uninterrupted government. It is the repeated reconstruction of authority after death. The Dalai Lama institution performs a daring inversion of ordinary politics. Most states insist that no individual is indispensable. Reincarnation declares that a particular compassionate activity is so necessary that it must return. Yet because it returns in the body of a child, the institution is repeatedly forced to confess its dependence upon fallible adults. Every succession therefore asks 2 questions. Where has the Dalai Lama been reborn? And who has the power to answer? For Tibetans, the first question belongs to karma, compassion, vision, memory, and religious discernment. For governments, the second belongs to law, territory, diplomacy, and control. The history of the Dalai Lamas has unfolded in the space between those questions. Somewhere in the future, after the death of Tenzin Gyatso, search parties may once again study dreams and directions. Lamas may travel in disguise. Reports may emerge of a child who speaks unexpectedly of Lhasa, recognizes a visitor, or reaches for an old rosary as though reclaiming something left behind. Elsewhere, officials may prepare regulations, seals, ceremonies, documents, and an ancient golden vessel. 2 groups may look upon 2 children. Each may proclaim that compassion has returned. Then the world will discover whether the Dalai Lama is created by a throne, authenticated by a government, disclosed by ritual, sustained by belief, or brought into being by all of them, uneasily and imperfectly, at once. The throne of the Dalai Lama began as the seat of a scholar. It became the center of a state. It survived as the symbol of a nation in exile. Its next occupant has not yet been found, but the struggle over who will recognize that child has already begun.
Om बाद में